All right, James, the 5th chapter. We have been staying through James. We're almost to the end. I'm thinking probably next week we'll conclude this study on James. But we are looking at this idea in James of how to be the complete Christian, right? What Christianity looks like. And in context of this morning, when the world pauses to remember the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I think it's worth noting that this is why Jesus died. This is why he gave his life for you and I. We've been painting James in the terms of the complete Christian or the unfractured man, right? Another way of saying it is the resurrected man. Jesus resurrected to life, bringing the possibility, capability, the blessing of your and I's lives being resurrected. Now, are we perfect in that resurrected life? No. But here's what we are aiming for. Here's what we are shooting for. So last week we had just touched upon chapter 5, 1 through 6. We're going to come back to this as we look at the dangers of wealth a little bit further before moving on. And you will recall that throughout the entire 4th chapter, James is dealing with arrogance and what arrogance looks like. He concluded chapter 4 with the arrogance of making plans and letting our plans get ahead of what needs to happen. Now, it's interesting to me that we concluded this chapter last week, and again, chapter 5, and then some of us went out to lunch yesterday, and last week. And I think part of the complete Christian is putting our faith into practice, right? One of the people we went out to eat with was approached last week by the waitress and said, "Hey, would you pray for the guy behind you? He's homeless." He was sitting right behind us, drinking a cup of coffee. Right? Had 80 layers of clothes stacked around him. Now, it was interesting when you're asked to pray for something like that, being we're studying James, what comes to your mind? Help him out. Maybe chapter 3, right? Is it chapter 3 that talks about praying, be warm, have peace? And not doing, I guess actually, it's a little bit further, isn't it? 2, thank you. And not doing anything? Yeah. Chapter 2. It's off the chapter. Right book, right concept. No, the individual that was approached had plans, had somewhere to be that week. Right? That day. They were planning on being in New Bethlehem at 2 o'clock, they said. Right? Now, to address the needs of this individual completely blows those plans out of the water. Right? Now, praying, sitting back down at the table and simply praying, it's pretty simple to do, isn't it? It's not a bad thing to do. But are you the answer to some of those prayers? Right? We talked last week about the last verse of chapter 4. So whosoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, to him is sin. And we talked about we isolate that verse so much, but it's in the context of making plans. Does doing right ever get in the way of your plans? Now, a number of people at the table gave some money for this individual, and they were able to give him a hotel room for the night. It was cold last week, even colder than it is this week, right? Was able to get him put up and put a room. And it's interesting that there was a lot of criticism about that. Some by the waitress that brought it to our attention, some by others. You know, this individual's probably a professional at this. That's true. People that live on the street are professionals that live in the street. Why don't you live that way? Because it's a cold, miserable life, right? The people who lived in absolute poverty at this time were professionals living in absolute poverty. So, does it cost some time? Does it cost money to take care of these things? Does it cost to show the love of Christ? Well, what's the alternative to these things? What are you, or what am I going to spend my time on? What am I going to spend my money on? That's what verses 1 through 6 at their heart are talking about. Right? What do I spend my time on? Now, and money. 1 through 6, I'm not sure if I mentioned this last week, but I do not believe that James is talking to anyone present or anyone reading his letter. When I say no one present, I think he's talking to everyone present when he reads it. What I mean is there's not a specific rich group of people that James is anticipating reading these words. He's writing these words for the benefit of the Christian, to say, be aware of the temptations and dangers of wealth. And understand that even though these wealthy individuals are able to persecute you, you're not on the wrong path. And so it's for the benefit of the Christians to read these, to avoid these temptations, and as we're going to see in a few minutes, to remain steadfast in light of the persecutions. Questions or comments? I threw a lot out on the table there.
To help people who might be an angel unawares.
Yeah.
How do you know that wasn't?
Yeah. Absolutely. So many have helped angels unawares, but I'm afraid that sometimes we even miss the point there, don't we? I better help this guy because there might be some benefit for me. I know you didn't, but you see what I'm saying, though? That I better help this individual because he might be an angel and it would be good for me.
Well, it's better if you help than if you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. The message of the Old Testament is about the oppression and lack of help to the poor, isn't it? It's amazing. I'd missed the prophets talk so much about that. So absolutely. So here's the question I think I'm going to frame these verses today with is, what do we do with our resources, time, money, and others, if they're not engaged in showing the love of Christ? That's what the rich man has to answer here. 1 through 6. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You've laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. Have you lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence? You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. So, James says, come on, you rich person, pay attention. Again, I think that's giving warning to the Christian. Don't fall into this. We talked about this earlier in James' epistle. Is it possible to have rich Christians? Absolutely. We in America better hope so, because we all fall into that rich category as we compare worldwide wealth, right? Here's the category we don't want to fall into. How are these riches used for this individual? They're used for self-indulgence, right? Not just self-indulgence, but for accumulating. Putting aside and not using. The silver corroded. How does that? Example of this very concept. Okay, did I die? Can anyone, they'll keep me up here until I get replaced. You all were helpful, Fred. I meant the battery replaced. Can anyone think of a biblical example of what this verse is talking about the silver becoming corroded? Can you think of an example of someone who did that?
The man that built up his barns.
Okay, the man who built up his barns was planning on doing this? Absolutely. Go ahead, Fred.
How about Judas Iscariot, the 30 pieces of silver?
Oh, see, here's two examples already that I wasn't even thinking of. Judas didn't even have his silver long enough to be corroded, but that corrosion can mean something a little bit different than how we think of it. Corrosion could mean improper use, right? Absolutely. Anyone else? Rich young ruler? There's another example I hadn't thought. I'm so glad I asked this question. The rich young ruler, is asking Jesus, what should I do? And Jesus says, essentially, use all your wealth to serve the poor, right? Not going to do it. Anyone else? Andy?
Talents and let him go to waste and did nothing with them.
Andy's my favorite student right now. That's the one I was thinking of. But you know what? I say it completely joke because these were examples I hadn't thought of that enriched the class. The parable of the talents, right? Two invested and made fruitful gain of what they were given. The third guy said, I'm not going to take any risk. I'm going to bury it so that I have it. And I think that's the exact idea. Why do we hoard riches today? Well, so I'll have it, right? And that's how silver becomes corroded, by sitting up, by having aside, rather than engaging in all the things that James has been talking about. In Matthew 25, Jesus talks about those who are without clothing. So there's all these people without clothing, and here my clothes are rotting away. Ernie, didn't you have some of your closet up here a few weeks ago? Stuff Pam doesn't allow you to use anymore. Yeah. We all have those, right? Unless we purge like Ernie was doing there. I mentioned a specific example of last week. I couldn't, in good conscience myself, sit and indulge in, more food than I need, right? That's what this means here. It means that I've put more into my body than my body can use. And let someone sit behind us and not have anything to eat. The use of our resources, that's what we're getting at. Are they engaged in doing good, or are they engaged, as this rich man is, in either self-indulgence or hoarding? Questions or comments on those ideas? It's worth noting we did not touch on it. He starts out verse 1. He says, "Miseries are coming upon you." And there's a lot of debate about what those miseries were. Of course, James is writing it's believed in Jerusalem. In just a few short years, Jerusalem is going to be utterly destroyed. Any wealth that was retained and hoarded or had in Jerusalem was going to be utterly destroyed. And I think that's maybe one of the applications, if not first context, is the people who stayed, who did not follow after Christ, stayed in Jerusalem because they thought it was impenetrable. And they lost everything, including their lives, right? They lost all their wealth. Others say this is talking about judgment, the final judgment. And that, our riches that have not been properly used are going to testify against us at the second coming. I think that's very applicable. Maybe when we think about what judgment or what source of judgment we're talking about, we're missing the whole point, aren't we? James is not talking about specific judgment as much as he is. As much as he's saying, as Christians, make sure you're engaged in what you know you should be doing. That's the point, right? The point is to avoid this other way of doing, not to know what judgment's coming to you if you go down that road. Go ahead, Fred.
What James is writing here, couldn't that be a warning to those that are wealthy in the congregation?
Yes, absolutely. It's a warning, I think, to those who are wealthy in the congregation, in the church. It is a warning to those who would desire to become wealthy within the church. Right? Absolutely. Good point, which isn't where I was focusing on, but is certainly applicable. Spot on. Ernie.
Not just to individuals, I don't think. It could be to the church itself.
Yeah. Absolutely. Another point that wasn't addressed, but yeah, the mentality of the church, right? What are we engaged in and doing? Absolutely. Thank you. Anything else? That's at the core of it, isn't it? Watch what you're worshiping. And along those lines, I'll use that to look at these last verse. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Remember the tongue. We have the choice with our tongue to build up or to tear down. The world is constantly engaged in tearing down, right? And James is saying, use your tongue to build up. Use your tongue to help. The same is true with our riches. The riches have been used to oppress the poor, is what's taking place in 4 and 5. At that time, it was not just customary, it was law to pay your hirings every day. Does anyone know why?
So they could eat that night.
So they could eat that night. I mean, that puts into, I think, into reference for me what it means to be rich. The laborer was to be paid daily so he could eat that day. He didn't have a bank account to go and to eat until he was paid. So what would happen? The rich man, because he can use the courts to his advantage, say, oh, you know what, I'll pay you tomorrow, and then I'll pay you tomorrow, and I'll pay you tomorrow. Right, in business, I had a guy teach me this years ago, and it served me relatively well. What happens quickly is people say, "Oh, I'm in this deep. If I don't stay with it, I'll never get paid." It's faulty logic. This man's logic was this way: if in our shoeing rotation works in 6-week rotations, if I've lived 6 weeks without that, then I really don't need it. So I'm going to move on. Served me really, really well. Here's my point, though. There's an individual who is with us a fair amount. He had, Pam and Ernie would remember, Chris would remember, he had Thanksgiving dinner with us a few years ago. My understanding is, not just from his word, but those around, and he was telling me towards the end of where he was working, I'm not being paid. I'm not being paid. His green card had expired. So what recourse did he have? None. None. There is a use of wealth to oppress the poor. I use that example to say this, that's the kind of stuff James is talking about, right? To what? To become wealthier, to not pay what's rightfully owed. Not the way we are to be as Christians, not the direction of life whatsoever. Questions or comments before we move on? All right, then let's look at 7 through 12. Would someone read those for us?
Therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord, behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath patience for it until he receives the early and latter rain. Be also patient, establish your heart, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge stands before the door. Take, my brethren, the prophet, who has spoken in the name of the Lord, from an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. Ye have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. But above all, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea, and your nay nay, lest ye fall into condemnation.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, all. Great to have you guys with us. So, James 5, 7 through 12, that Bob just read for us, is, in short, saying this to the Christian. Things aren't always going to go your way, right? Things aren't always going to be the way you want them to be. They're not even going to be right. How many of you have ever experienced something in life and you said, that's just not right? Has anyone here experienced that? I would think all of us. And so, what does the world say when something is not right? I'll take an extreme example here, something that wouldn't happen. Emily wrongs me. She steals from me. What's the world say? I'll get her.
You deserve
That I deserve it. Now that's the opposite of where I was going, Kevin. You've been talking to Amanda. You do hear that. Okay, so that still fits, though, where I was going from. Oh, he deserves that. What's that mean? I did wrong to someone else, probably Amanda, and he deserves to have something wrong happen to him. Let's take this to the flip side. Same thought process, though. Well, I'll get you, right? When the real big kid gives you a hard time in school, well, I can't just punch him because that would hurt. But wait until he's late coming out of school or late coming out of the workplace, and I'll get him. I'll flatten his tires, right? I'll take care of it. Here is the picture of the Christian that's being painted. Be patient when suffering wrong. We just talked, or James just talked in 1 through 6 about some of the sources of these struggles. People that are going to oppress you. People are going to wrong you. Is that a Christian thing? No, it's about power. It's about powerful oppressing the not so powerful. What do? Know that God's in control. And have faith in Him. He will take care of it. Right? Romans 12. Return no man evil for evil. Right? But overcome with good. The verse either prior or right after there says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. You leave it in His hands. Right? That's the short of what James is saying. Questions or comments before we get into some of the specifics of this passage?
Sometimes if you don't understand what's happening, then if you do the right thing, then later on you'll understand that that was the way it was supposed to be.
Oh, man. Spot on, Emily, because verse 11 uses Job as an example. It sounds like you just described Job, right? Yeah, absolutely. Just do what's right. You might not know what's going on, what the end result or purpose is, but do what is right. The world says being wronged is justification to retaliate, to do wrong myself. James is saying that's not the look of the complete godly person. Right? Now, this, verse 7, I think is more helpful than I ever realized. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. Be patient. How many of you get tired of waiting on patience? Hurry up, raise your hands. I struggle with patience, right? I mean, I've sometimes joked, but it's not entirely a joke. I used to pray for patience, but I gave up waiting for it. Right? And actually, I find when you pray for patience, I get a lot of troubles. Okay, James starts his book that way, doesn't he? Now, I didn't know this, but there are two different Greek words that we translate patience. One means to hold on like a bulldog, right? And not to let go. You grasp a hold of it, no one can shake you loose. And that's used a lot. The whole book of Hebrews is about that kind of patience. Saying, hold on to Jesus Christ and don't let go of Him no matter what. That kind of patience. That kind of patience, I'm better at. Amanda says I'm stubborn. I'm going to tell you I'm patient in that way. I can grab a hold of something and just not let go, stay on task until it's done. That kind of patience I've got. But here's the problem with that. That kind of patience doesn't work when you're in traffic, does it? That kind of patience doesn't work when you're traveling with someone that you're uncomfortable with their driving with. That kind of patience doesn't work so often in life. Here's what this word for patience means. Both times in this verse, it means submit to. Submit to. James is not saying, hold on to your goal and don't let go no matter what. He's saying, accept the oppression. Submit to it. Seems vaguely familiar, doesn't it? Doesn't it remind us of exactly what Jesus did? So imagine this. Now I'm in traffic, right? There's a big message for marriage here, right? It's a really big message for marriage. I'm in traffic, and cars are driving too slow, and nothing's going my way, and blood pressure's going up. And I've oftentimes said, well, I've got to be patient. I just have to be miserable till I get there, And normally I break a handful of driving laws to overcome the situation, right? And that's the best I can manage for patience. The kind of patience that James is talking about here is a deep breath. This is the situation I'm in. Okay, I'm not going to get there when I thought I was. This is where I'm at. So I said that it has a deep message for marriage, because sometimes Amanda's type A like me, right? So Amanda thinks I have to be patient with Mike until I get him properly trained. Jerry, remember the advice you gave me? Jerry told me right before I got married, said, Mike, you're marrying that girl because she's everything you ever dreamt of. But she's marrying you because she thinks she can make you the man she's dreaming of. So the idea of patience in a relationship, right, is, I have to endure you till I can get you beat into where you need to be. The idea of patience that James is talking about, I'm dealing with one another. She's dealing with me. I think this is so enlightening to all the verses about submitting to one another. Ephesians 5 talks about that in context of marriage. Elsewhere, Galatians talks about Christians submitting to one another. And here has been my problem with submitting to one another my whole life. That means, in my mind, how I've defined it in the past, that I have to do what you want me to do. And that's really bad way of submitting, isn't it? Because you may or may not have a better vision than my own. You may not be more right than me. I'm no longer talking about Amanda. The rest of you may not be more right than me. The idea, and notice what James says immediately after this, verse 9, do not grumble against one another. The idea of being patient, the idea of submitting to one another, is saying, we're all people. You're going to see it differently. That's okay. And I can work with you. I can be with you. I can get through this with you. Very different concepts, right? That first kind of patience would say, the rich man's oppressing me, man, I'm going to chop his knees out from under him first chance I get. The second kind of patience says, it's all right. God's in control. I have faith. He will make everything right. Questions, comments? We'll end with these couple of examples that James gives. Verse 10, as an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. We take all those Old Testament prophets. What happened to them almost without fail? Yep. Killed, right? They were killed. Ultimately, God knew, God was there for them. What's he say we say about them? They were blessed. They gave way to the more righteous way. Secondly, Job, right? Job had terrible things happen to him. In the end, he was blessed. Remember who's in control, who's going to make things right. Questions or comments? Thank you for your attention.